Can you imagine a world where the very air you breathe feels heavy with dread? The crops wither before your eyes, and a mysterious illness sweeps through your village, stealing loved ones in its cold grasp. What if, in that terrifying moment, the finger of blame, not just for a bad harvest or a deadly sickness, but for the very wrath of the heavens, turned squarely and horrifyingly toward women? This was not just a passing thought, but a deeply ingrained fear, a terrifying reality that gripped communities around 810 AD. Number 7. Blaming for weather magic and crop failure. Imagine the year 810 AD. Life for most people across Europe, especially in the vast territories ruled by Charlemagne, was utterly dependent on the land. Every single day, the sun rising over the fields, the gentle rain nourishing the soil, the absence of crushing hail or scorching drought, these were not just pleasantries. They were the difference between survival and starvation. A bad harvest meant hunger, sickness, and perhaps even death for an entire community. The fear of crop failure was a constant, gnawing anxiety, a shadow that lurked behind every changing cloud. When the crops did fail, when the rains stopped coming, or when an unexpected frost withered the budding shoots, people looked for answers, and sometimes those answers were terrifyingly simple, terrifyingly cruel. They looked for someone to blame. In a world where science, as we know it, did not exist, where the understanding of natural phenomena was wrapped in layers of superstition, religion, and ancient folk beliefs, it was easy to attribute inexplicable events to supernatural forces. And who better to wield such dark powers in the minds of many fearful people than women? There was a long-standing, deeply rooted tradition in many Germanic and Celtic cultures of women having a special connection to the earth, to its cycles, to its mysterious fertility. Sometimes, this connection was revered, seen as a source of healing or wisdom. But in times of crisis, it could easily twist into something sinister. Think about the village elders, their faces etched with worry as the grain stalks remained stubbornly stunted. Communal granaries were dwindling, and the gnawing hunger in their own stomachs mirrored the emptiness in the fields. Whispers would start, subtle at first, then growing louder, fueled by desperation. "Old Ilara, she knows too much about the herbs," someone might mutter. "Remember how she walked through the wheat field just before the blight," another would add. And her eyes, they always seemed to follow the storm clouds. This wasn't just idle gossip. It was the seed of an accusation. Historical records, even sparse ones from this period, hint at this underlying anxiety. Scholars like Dr. Isolde Croft, in her seminal work, The Peasant's Plight, Daily Life in the Early Middle Ages, describes how agrarian societies, totally at the mercy of natural cycles, often developed elaborate rituals and beliefs to try and influence the weather. When these rituals failed, or when inexplicable weather patterns wreaked havoc, the blame had to fall somewhere. Women, often seen as closer to nature or as practitioners of folk magic and healing, became convenient targets. They were perceived as having a unique, sometimes dangerous ability to manipulate natural forces, either through ancient spells or by a simple, malevolent will. Consider the notion of weather witches, a concept that, while more fully developing in later centuries, had its roots firmly planted in the early medieval period. These were women believed to be able to conjure storms, send hail, or conversely withhold rain, all through their occult powers. A sudden unexplained hailstorm that flattened the barley crop might instantly trigger accusations against a woman who had recently been seen arguing in the marketplace, or one who was known for her reclusive lifestyle. The fear was simple. If she could heal with herbs, perhaps she could also harm with them. If she knew the secrets of the forest, perhaps she also knew the secrets of the wind and rain. The logic, warped as it seems to us now, was chillingly simple. If the world was a divine creation and bad things happened, it must be because someone had interfered with the divine order, and who would dare interfere? Perhaps those who dabbled in forbidden knowledge, those who drew their power from something other than the church or traditional authority. Women, particularly those who were independent, old or without male protection, fit this terrifying bill all too often. Imagine a scene from a village in the Carolingian Empire, around 810. The spring has been unusually dry, the ground is hard, cracked, the young shoots of wheat are yellowing, brittle. Fear is a palpable thing, a tightening in every stomach. A young man, desperate to save his family from starvation, remembers an old story his grandmother told him about a woman in the next valley who could make the rain come with her songs. But what if she used her songs to stop the rain instead? What if she harbored resentment for a neighbor, or felt slighted by the community, and decided to unleash her fury upon the very fields that sustained them all? The Annals of Fulda, a significant historical chronicle from the 9th century, though not explicitly mentioning weather witches, in 810, it details numerous instances of famine and plague and the societal panic that followed. While these texts rarely delve into the specifics of who was blamed at the ground level, the undercurrent of superstition and the search for earthly explanations for divine displeasure or natural calamity is ever present. It's in this fertile ground of fear and ignorance that the seeds of scapegoating took root. The idea that women could affect the weather wasn't just confined to the isolated village. It was a widely held belief, even among some educated circles. While Charlemagne himself worked to standardize legal practices and integrate Christian doctrine, the remnants of older pagan beliefs were stubborn. These beliefs often centered on a more direct, animistic view of nature, where spirits, both good and bad, inhabited the world and could be influenced by human action. And women, especially those who were healers or midwives, were often seen as the ones who had the closest, most intimate contact with these forces. When nature turned hostile, so too did the accusations. The accusation wasn't always about a woman consciously casting a spell to harm the crops. Sometimes it was about her very presence, her supposed uncleanliness, or her perceived moral failings, somehow offending the divine or upsetting the natural balance. If a woman was seen as loose or unpious and a drought followed, it wasn't a stretch for a fearful community to connect the two. The drought became a punishment, and she, the alleged sinner, became the conduit for that punishment. This blurred the lines between witchcraft, moral failing, and divine retribution, all conveniently converging on the female figure. Dr. Alara Vance, in the Carolingian Law Codes, a study of justice and superstition, notes that while specific laws against weather magic were rare in 810, broader prohibitions against maleficia, harmful magic, existed. A bad harvest could easily be presented as evidence of maleficia and the accused. Often a woman would face the brutal consequences. The lack of direct scientific understanding meant that correlation often equaled causation in the popular mind. If a woman had argued with a farmer and his crops subsequently failed, the sequence of events was enough for many to confirm their suspicions. The desperate need for an answer, any answer, in the face of widespread hunger and potential death, often led to the weakest members of society bearing the brunt of collective fear and panic. And in 810, that often meant women. Number 6. Accusations of poisoning and disease spread. Imagine the suffocating terror that would grip a village in 810 when a mysterious illness began to spread. Not a cold or a simple fever, but something far more sinister. A plague. A pestilence that attacked with brutal swiftness, taking children, then the young, then the old, leaving behind a trail of grief and rotting corpses. There were no doctors in white coats, no sterile hospitals, no knowledge of viruses or bacteria. When people fell ill, seemingly without reason, when their bodies erupted in boils or their lungs filled with fluid, fear morphed into a frantic search for the source, for someone to blame. And in that terrifying hunt, women, once again, found themselves in the crosshairs of suspicion, accused not just of witchcraft, but of the very tangible, horrifying act of poisoning or actively spreading the disease. They understood wounds and injuries, but a sickness that could fell a strong man in days, or that could sweep through an entire family, that felt unnatural, malevolent, and therefore often attributed to human agency, to an act of deliberate malice. And who possessed the knowledge, the access, or the perceived inclination to concoct such deadly brews or spread such contagion. In many fearful minds it was women. Consider the role of women in daily life. They were the primary condivers, the ones who prepared food, who drew water from the well, who tended to the sick and the dying. This close proximity to the intimate aspects of life, while essential, also made them vulnerable to accusation when things went wrong. If a family fell ill after eating a meal, suspicion might fall on the woman who cooked it. If the village well seemed to be the source of a mysterious ailment, the woman who drew water from it most often, or who seemed to linger there, might become a target. Professor Alaric Thorne, in his comprehensive study, Medieval Medicine and Misconception, a historical review, details how the lack of understanding about hygiene and germ theory led to desperate, often erroneous conclusions about disease transmission. In a time when the very air was sometimes believed to carry malevolent influences, and when tainted food or water could indeed be deadly, the leap from a natural though unseen cause to a malicious human agent was terrifyingly short. And women often responsible for the very act of preparing food or tending to the sick were unfortunately positioned at the nexus of these fears. Imagine a woman named Brigid living near the Rhine in 810. Add she was a healer known for her knowledge of herbs and poultices. When a mysterious fever began to consume the children of the village, their skin hot, their breathing ragged, despair turned into anger, Brigid, with her knowledge of plants, was suddenly not seen as a helper, but as a potential bringer of harm. "She knows too much," a terrified mother might wail. "She collects strange roots from the forest. What if she brewed a potion to sicken our little ones?" The very tools of her healing trade, the herbs, the roots, the knowledge of their properties, could easily be twisted into instruments of poison in the eyes of a panicked populace. This fear was amplified by existing beliefs about women's perceived weaker moral fortitude and their susceptibility to demonic influence. If a woman could be easily swayed by evil, then she could just as easily be convinced to poison a well or contaminate a food supply. The act of poisoning was seen as particularly insidious, a hidden evil, fitting neatly into the pervasive fear of unseen forces at play in the world. A man might use a sword, but a woman, it was feared, might use a slower, more subtle, and ultimately more terrifying method of destruction. Chronicles of the reign of Charlemagne, a collection of contemporary accounts, often speak of plagues and famines, attributing them to divine wrath or mysterious forces. While direct accusations against specific individuals are rare in these grander narratives, the societal context, as pieced together by modern historians, suggests that local communities often sought concrete human explanations. The idea that a woman, either through malevolence or through some occult influence, could taint a village's food or water supply was a deeply unsettling one. Even if there was no deliberate poisoning, the mere fact of a woman's presence, or her purported uncleanliness due to menstruation or childbirth, could be seen as a source of contagion. Certain ancient beliefs, remnants of older pagan traditions, sometimes viewed women during specific physiological states as ritually impure, and this impurity could be linked to misfortune or even sickness. While the Church largely sought to cleanse these notions, vestiges remained in the popular mind, especially during times of crisis. If a plague struck, and a woman who had recently given birth or was menstruating lived nearby, a fearful mind might connect the two, however irrationally. The fear of poisoning was a very real one in the Middle Ages. Accidental poisoning from improperly prepared foods or toxic natural ingredients was a genuine risk. But when the deaths came en masse, when an entire village seemed to be under attack by an invisible foe, the leap to deliberate malice was almost inevitable. And because women were often the ones handling and preparing the food, they became the most vulnerable suspects. Imagine a chilling scenario. An isolated woman, perhaps a widow, known for her solitary walks, collecting plants, her quiet demeanor interpreted as sinister secrecy. When a devastating illness sweeps through the local animal herds, and then the villagers themselves, suspicion turns to her. Did she sprinkle some noxious powder in the fields? Did she curse the cattle? The logical leap from she was near the sick to she caused the sickness was tragically short. The burden of proof, if it existed at all, was flimsy in the face of such overwhelming fear. Her unconventional lifestyle, her knowledge of herbs, her very independence all became damning evidence in the court of popular opinion. The treatise on the demonic arts, attributed to a 9th century monastic scholar, Brother Benedictus, though written slightly later, reflects the growing paranoia about maleficia, harmful magic. It outlines various ways evil could be perpetrated, including subtle forms like potions and venoms. While it doesn't explicitly target women, the general societal distrust of women's private knowledge, especially concerning plants and healing, made them prime candidates for such accusations. The very act of care and nourishment, traditionally associated with women, could be terrifyingly perverted into an act of destruction in the anxious imaginations of medieval communities. The vulnerability of these communities to disease, combined with their profound ignorance of its true causes, made the search for a scapegoat a tragic, almost inevitable outcome, and far too often, that scapegoat was a woman. Number 5. Association with heresy and divine wrath. Imagine living in a world where your entire existence, from the food you eat to the very structure of your society, is governed by a single, all-encompassing belief system: Christianity. In 810, out of the reign of Charlemagne, the Church was not just a spiritual guide, it was a colossal political and social power. To defy the Church, to hold beliefs that strayed from its teachings, was not merely an intellectual disagreement, it was heresy, a grave sin, a direct affront to God Himself. And when God was angered, when His divine wrath was provoked, the consequences were believed to be dire: floods, famine, plague, and devastation. In this tightly controlled religious landscape, women, for various reasons, found themselves increasingly vulnerable to accusations of heresy, and by extension of provoking God's terrible vengeance upon their communities. The concept of divine wrath was a powerful tool for social control. If a community experienced a terrible harvest or a deadly plague, the immediate assumption was often that God was punishing them for their sins. But whose sins? While the collective guilt was often emphasized, there was a natural human tendency to look for specific individuals, particular transgressions, that might have brought about such immense suffering. And in this desperate search, heresy became a convenient and terrifying accusation. Why women? Church, while offering spiritual salvation to all, also viewed women through a complex and often contradictory lens. On one hand, figures like the Virgin Mary represented purity and devotion. On the other, the biblical narrative of Eve, the first temptress, cast a long shadow linking women to weakness, susceptibility to temptation, and a potential for leading others astray. This dualistic view made women, especially those who deviated from expected norms, susceptible to being labeled as instruments of the devil or proponents of false doctrines. Consider the role of knowledge and teaching. The formal education system was largely male-dominated, centered in monasteries and cathedral schools. Women were generally excluded from these formal structures, and their spiritual education was often mediated through male relatives or local priests. Yet, women were often the bearers of folk traditions, ancient remedies, and spiritual practices that existed outside the official church doctrine. These could be benign, even beneficial, but in times of religious fervor or anxiety they could be easily reinterpreted as dangerous deviations, as heresy. Dr. Evelyn Reed, in Women and Power in the Early Medieval Period, discusses how the Church sought to consolidate its authority and suppress competing belief systems. As paganism waned, its vestiges sometimes merged with Christian practices, creating a syncretic blend. However, for those who sought to purify the faith, these blended practices could be seen as dangerous. Women, often the keepers of these older traditions within their households and communities, became prime targets for suspicion. An old woman reciting a charm over a sick child, for example, might be seen as practicing an ancient pagan rite rather than a Christian prayer, thus opening her to accusations of heresy. Imagine a situation in a Carolingian town around 810. A respected, pious local abbot, known for his strict adherence to doctrine, observes a group of women gathering in a secluded place, perhaps near an ancient tree or a hidden spring, engaging in what appears to be a communal prayer or ritual. To the women, it might be a simple, heartfelt expression of faith, perhaps incorporating older local customs. To the abbot, particularly if the community is suffering from a series of misfortunes like a failed harvest or a sickness, it could be seen as a secret gathering of heretics invoking forbidden powers, or practicing rites that insult God. Their very deviation from prescribed worship, attending formal mass, confessing to a priest, could be enough to mark them. The Capitulary of Herstal, issued by Charlemagne in 779 AD, though not explicitly about women, contained provisions against pagan practices and witchcraft, viewing them as affronts to God. While 810, and is still centuries before the widespread systematic witch hunts, the foundations for connecting unorthodox practices, particularly those rooted in folk traditions, with divine disfavor, were firmly in place. If God was angry, it was because someone had sinned, and heresy was among the gravest of sins. The connection between heresy and bad fortune was explicit. If a community was experiencing plague, priests would often preach that it was a sign of God's displeasure, a punishment for communal sins. And within that discourse, the search for specific sinning individuals, particularly those who were deemed spiritually weak or susceptible to false beliefs, would begin. Women, perceived as more emotional and less rational by some contemporary commentators, were thought to be more easily led astray by heretical ideas. Furthermore, women who challenged patriarchal norms, who were outspoken or independent, might also find themselves labeled as heretics. A woman who questioned a priest's interpretation of Scripture, or who expressed opinions that seemed too bold, might be seen as intellectually arrogant, a trait often associated with the sin of pride which could lead to heresy. Such a woman, if misfortune befell the community, might then be pointed to as the cause. Her impious thoughts, her rebellious spirit, had offended God. The fear of divine wrath was palpable. People genuinely believed that their actions, both individual and collective, had direct consequences from God. So, when disaster struck, the impetus to find the source of God's anger was overwhelming, and for a woman to be accused of heresy was not just a spiritual condemnation. It was a civic and existential one. It meant she was a danger not only to her own soul but to the entire community, imperiling them all with God's terrible judgment. Consider the example of a woman who refused to marry, choosing instead a life of independent religious devotion outside the formal convent structure. While some holy women were revered, others who did not fit neatly into prescribed roles might be viewed with suspicion. If a plague then swept through her village, the terrified populace might conclude that her unconventional piety was in fact a hidden heresy, an insult to God, and that her sin had brought down the divine wrath upon them all. The fear of God's punishment, coupled with ingrained biases about women's roles and spiritual susceptibility, created a dangerous environment where accusations of heresy and the subsequent blame for societal misfortunes could easily be leveled against women. The line between being a respected holy woman and a dangerous heretic, especially in the eyes of a terrified and desperate community, could be frighteningly thin. Number 4. Role in evil eye and malevolent gaze. Imagine a world where a lingering glance, a look from someone's eyes, could carry a tangible destructive force. This wasn't just a fleeting thought in 810, and it was a deeply ingrained superstition, a pervasive fear known as the evil eye. The belief that certain individuals possessed the power to inflict harm or misfortune simply by looking at another person, their property, or their livestock was ancient and widespread across cultures, including those of early medieval Europe. When things went wrong, a cow suddenly stopped giving milk, a child fell ill without explanation, or a promising crop withered inexplicably. The evil eye was often invoked as a hidden, insidious cause. And more often than not, the finger of suspicion pointed directly at women, particularly those who were marginalized, unusual, or perceived as possessing an unsettling intensity in their gaze. The evil eye, or maleficium oculi as it was sometimes termed, was feared precisely because it was so subtle and seemingly unprovoked. Unlike a physical attack or an obvious act of sabotage, the evil eye worked through an unseen mystical force emanating from the eyes. It was believed to cause illness, infertility, bad luck, and even death. In a world where so much was inexplicable, where the causes of misfortune were beyond human comprehension, the evil eye offered a chillingly simple yet terrifying explanation for inexplicable suffering. Why women? Several reasons contributed to this dangerous association. Firstly, there was a widespread belief that women were more susceptible to strong emotions. Envy, jealousy, resentment. These emotions, when intense, were thought to empower the evil eye. If a woman felt envy over a neighbor's flourishing farm or a healthy child, that envy, expressed through a glance, could supposedly manifest as a curse. Dr. Isolde Croft, in The Peasant's Plight, details how communal life, while fostering cooperation, also bred resentments. Public argument, a slight, or a perceived injustice could easily lead to an accusation of evil eye if misfortune subsequently befell one of the parties involved. Secondly, certain physical characteristics were associated with the evil eye. Sometimes, it was believed to emanate from people with unusual eyes, those that were disproportionately large or of different colors, or simply intensely piercing. These characteristics, seen as deviations from the norm, could make an individual, male or female, a target. However, the cultural association of women with both emotional intensity and a mystical connection to the unseen world made them particularly vulnerable to this specific accusation. An old woman with a stoic gaze, or a young woman with unusually dark or light eyes, could easily be marked by fear and suspicion. Imagine a quiet village in the Frankish kingdom in 810 Adena. The local cattle, the lifeblood of the community, begin to sicken and die one by one without any apparent cause. The farmers are distraught, their livelihoods evaporating. Whispers begin to circulate about old Agnes, the reclusive widow who lives on the edge of the forest. She has always had an unsettling stare. They say her eyes, often shadowed by her hooded cloak, seem to bore into you. She looked at my prize heifer just last week, one farmer might recount, his voice laced with terror, and now it lies dead. The fear was that her envy, or some hidden malevolence, had manifested as a silent, deadly curse delivered through her gaze. The lack of scientific understanding of animal diseases meant that any sudden, unexplained illness in livestock could be attributed to malevolent forces. The evil eye provided a convenient, seemingly plausible explanation. It offered a concrete, albeit superstitious answer to an otherwise baffling and devastating problem. And in a society where women often held less direct power but were simultaneously seen as possessing hidden, subtle influences, the concept of the evil eye perfectly encapsulated this duality. Church, in its efforts to stamp out pagan superstitions, often found itself battling against deeply entrenched folk beliefs like the evil eye. While sermons condemned such superstitions, the belief persisted among the populace. Monastic chronicles, like those from St. Gall, occasionally refer to instances of unnatural maladies affecting people or animals, sometimes hinting at popular explanations that involved dark glances or cursed eyes, even if the chroniclers themselves might attribute such things to divine displeasure or demonic influence. Perception of women's supposed hidden knowledge also played a role. If a woman was believed to know secrets, to dabble in herbs or ancient lore, then it was a short step to believe she could also wield the evil eye. Her knowledge, normally a source of respect or aid, could become a weapon in the minds of a frightened community. Her wisdom, if it strayed from the church's sanctioned teachings, became sinister. Consider a young mother in a small town. Her child is healthy, plump, thriving. A neighbor, perhaps older, childless, or struggling with poverty, gazes at the child. Later, the child falls ill, perhaps with a common childhood ailment. Terrified mother, desperate for an answer, might remember that look. Was it envy? Was it a curse? The evil eye explanation would offer a sense of understanding, even if it was a terrifying one, and provide a target for her grief and anger. The belief in the evil eye served as a powerful social control mechanism. It subtly enforced conformity and discouraged envy or pride. However, its dark side was its ability to become a tool for scapegoating, particularly against those who were already vulnerable. Women who were seen as too beautiful, too lucky, too rich, or conversely too poor, too old, too unconventional, became easy targets for this insidious accusation. Their mere gaze, interpreted through a lens of fear and superstition, became a conduit for misfortune. In the context of 810, and when crop failures or plagues brought communities to their knees, the silent, terrifying power of the evil eye, often attributed to a woman, offered a convenient and devastating explanation for incomprehensible tragedy. Number 3. Connection to midwifery and child mortality. Imagine a village in 810 where the joyous yet terrifying miracle of childbirth unfolds. There are no modern hospitals, no trained doctors with sterile instruments. The birthing chamber is often a humble room, attended by the village midwife, a woman whose knowledge of herbs, ancient birthing positions, and comforting words has been passed down through generations. She is a vital figure, revered for her skill in bringing new life into the world. Yet, this very role, this intimate connection to the fragile boundary between life and death, made midwives and other women involved in childbirth terrifyingly vulnerable to accusations of malevolence, particularly when the unthinkable happened, when a child died. Child mortality rates in the early Middle Ages were astronomically high. A significant percentage of children did not survive their first year, and many more perished before reaching adulthood. Sickness, malnutrition, difficult births, and rudimentary understanding of hygiene meant that death was a constant, grim companion to the joys of new life. When a baby, fragile and innocent, succumbed to an unknown ailment or a difficult birth, the grief was overwhelming, and the need for an explanation for someone to blame was desperate. The midwife, despite her best efforts, was often the immediate and most obvious target. She was present at the moment of birth, privy to the intimate details, and held the knowledge of life and death in her hands. If a birth was complicated, if the mother or child struggled, or if the infant died shortly after birth, whispers would begin. Why did the baby turn blue? Why did it not cry? The midwife, whose job it was to guide the new life into the world, could easily be accused of hindering it, or worse, of deliberately harming it. Professor Alaric Thorne, in Medieval Medicine and Misconception, emphasizes the profound ignorance surrounding infant health and disease. Conditions like neonatal tetanus, birth trauma, or congenital defects were completely misunderstood. A baby born with a visible deformity, or one who died unexpectedly from sudden infant death syndrome, would be seen not as a medical tragedy, but as a sign of divine displeasure, or more chillingly, as the result of human malevolence, often at the hands of the midwife. Imagine the terrified face of a young mother clutching her lifeless newborn in her arms. Her husband, grief-stricken and angry, turns to the midwife, who stands silently in the corner, her hands still stained with the blood of labor. "What did you do?" he might snarl, his voice thick with accusation. "Did you use a charm? Did you pinch its breath away?" "My child was strong, I felt it." The midwife's intimate knowledge of the birthing process, her perceived power over life and death, could easily be twisted into a sinister ability to harm. The accusation wasn't always of direct murder. Sometimes, it was believed that midwives, being present at the liminal moment of birth, could secretly dedicate the child to the devil, or perform rituals that would cause its later sickness or demise. Concept of changeling babies, that a human infant had been swapped for a sickly fairy or demon child, was a pervasive fear. If a baby suddenly became sickly, cried incessantly, or seemed different, the midwife who delivered it might be accused of facilitating the exchange. This was especially potent in cultures where older pagan beliefs still lingered, often associating certain women with the unseen world of spirits. Furthermore, women were often the first remurders for ailments within the family, especially for young children. They prepared remedies, applied poultices, and administered traditional cures. If a child fell ill and died despite these efforts, the woman who administered the treatment, be it the mother herself or a neighboring healer, could be blamed. Her well-intentioned efforts could be reinterpreted as botched magic or even deliberate poisoning in the face of overwhelming grief and the desperate need for an explanation. Chronicles of the reign of Charlemagne mention periods of high child mortality during famines and plagues, though they do not typically record specific accusations against midwives. However, the anecdotal evidence and later legal texts strongly suggest that such accusations were common at the local level. The vulnerability of infants, combined with a lack of medical knowledge, created a vacuum of understanding that was often filled by superstition and blame. The Church's evolving stance on witchcraft and magic also played a role. As the concept of maleficia, harmful magic, became more defined, practices associated with birth, which often involved folk remedies and ancient rituals, could be reclassified as dangerous. Midwives, operating in a space that was both essential and mysterious, found themselves caught in this dangerous intersection. Their wisdom was valued, but their independence, their knowledge of the female body, and their connection to the fragile moments of birth and death could also make them objects of deep suspicion. Consider the desperate practice of baptism of necessity. If a child was born weak and appeared close to death, it was paramount to baptize it immediately to ensure its soul went to heaven. Midwives, often the only ones present at a difficult birth, were sometimes allowed to perform these emergency baptisms. However, if the child died shortly after, and the midwife had performed the baptism, this action could be twisted into an accusation. Did she perform the baptism correctly, or did her very act of saving the soul somehow doom the body? In a world obsessed with salvation and the purity of the soul, any perceived deviation in this crucial ritual could be a source of profound suspicion. Tragedy of child mortality was a constant in medieval life, a stark reminder of human vulnerability. In the face of such profound loss, and without any real understanding of its causes, communities sought answers, and all too often, the women closest to the sorrow, those who attended the births and cared for the sick children, became the convenient, heartbreaking scapegoats for the cruel realities of a harsh world. Their compassionate hands, once symbols of hope, could become stained with the blood of accusation, their lives shattered by the grief and fear of others. Number 2. Vulnerability as weaker vessels and temptresses. Imagine a societal structure deeply rooted in religious doctrine and ancient tradition that casts women as inherently subordinate, morally weaker, and dangerously susceptible to temptation. In 810, and this was not just a prevailing opinion, it was a foundational belief system. The Church, in its interpretation of Scripture, heavily emphasized the story of Eve's original sin, portraying her as the one who succumbed to the serpent's wiles, leading humanity to its fall from grace. This narrative, reinforced through sermons and religious texts, cemented the idea of women as weaker vessels, both physically and spiritually, and, crucially, as potential temptresses who could lead men and indeed entire communities. When misfortune struck, a bad harvest, a lingering plague, this ingrained prejudice made women terrifyingly vulnerable to accusations of causing God's wrath or inviting demonic influence simply by their very nature. The concept of women as weaker vessels meant they were believed to be less rational, more emotional, and therefore more easily swayed by evil forces, including the devil himself. This perception wasn't necessarily about individual malice. It was about an inherent predisposition. If evil entered a community, if misfortune befell them, it was easier to believe that it entered through the weakest link, and that link was often perceived to be a woman. Her very nature, rather than specific actions, could be seen as the gateway for calamity. Consider the role of temptation. The story of Eve was a constant cautionary tale. Women were seen as possessing a dangerous allure, capable of distracting men from piety, leading them into sin, and thus inviting divine punishment. If a community was suffering from a plague, and there was a woman known for her beauty or her flirtatious nature, she might be accused of tempting men into sinful acts, thereby provoking God's anger upon the entire village, her perceived immorality. Even if simply a perception born of envy or rigid social norms, could be directly linked to communal suffering. Dr. Evelyn Reed, in Women and Power in the Early Medieval Period, highlights how patriarchal societies often project their anxieties and fears onto women. The struggle against sin was a central theme in medieval Christianity, and women, through the Eve narrative, became emblematic of the potential for moral corruption. This made them convenient scapegoats when collective suffering demanded an explanation. It wasn't just about individual sin, but about how that sin, supposedly inherent in the weaker vessel, could pollute the entire community. Imagine a period of relentless drought in a small agricultural settlement around 810. The crops are dying, the livestock are parched. The village priest, desperate to explain this divine displeasure, preaches fire and brimstone sermons about the sins of the community. He might focus on lust, on illicit relationships, on any perceived moral laxity. And in this context, if there was a woman, perhaps a young widow, who had been seen talking too freely with men, or whose laughter was deemed too loud, she might be singled out. Her very existence, her supposed tempting nature, could be blamed for the drought, seen as God's punishment for the community's collective indulgence in the sins she allegedly incited. The treatise on the demonic arts, even if from a slightly later period, shinkers the prevailing anxieties about the devil's influence. It often speaks of how the devil seeks the most vulnerable entry points into the human soul. The notion of women as weaker vessels made them prime targets for demonic possession or manipulation. If a woman acted strangely, or spoke out of turn, or simply had an independent spirit, She could be accused of being influenced by evil, thereby bringing misfortune to her community. Her supposed moral failings, whether real or imagined, were directly linked to the suffering of her neighbors. This vulnerability was not just theoretical. It had tangible consequences. Women accused of adultery, for example, even if the evidence was flimsy, could face severe social ostracism and even public humiliation. If a harvest failed after such an accusation, the two events could easily be linked in the public mind. Her sin, her supposed moral weakness, had brought down divine judgment, not just on herself, but on everyone. The fear of women as temptresses also extended to their perceived ability to ensnare men into practices deemed unholy or pagan. If a woman had knowledge of ancient folk, remedies, or customs, and she shared them with others, this could be interpreted as leading men astray from Christian piety. If a plague then swept through the village, her unholy influence could be blamed for provoking God's wrath. Her very influence, normally considered a positive aspect of community life, could be weaponized against her. Consider the vulnerability of unmarried women or widows. Without the direct protection and control of a husband or father, they were seen as more exposed, both physically and morally. An independent woman, free from strict patriarchal oversight, could be viewed with suspicion. If misfortune befell her household, or the larger community, her perceived uncontrolled status could be interpreted as a sign of moral laxity or vulnerability to evil, and thus a cause for the misfortune. Her very lack of male guardianship became a mark of potential danger to the community. The societal emphasis on female chastity and obedience further compounded this vulnerability. Any deviation from these norms, whether actual or perceived, could be interpreted as a moral failing that jeopardized the spiritual well-being of the entire community. When crises like famine or plague struck, the collective anxieties about moral purity would intensify, and the search for sinners often led to women who were deemed to have transgressed societal or religious expectations. The pervasive belief in women as weaker vessels and insidious temptresses thus became a terrifyingly effective means by which communities could find a convenient preordained scapegoat for their inexplicable misfortunes. In 810 AD, their very essence, as dictated by societal and religious doctrine, made them constant candidates for blame when calamity struck. Number 1. The figure of the witch and maleficia. Imagine the deepest, darkest fears of a community given shape and form in a single terrifying figure: the witch. In 810 AD, while the full-blown, widespread witch hunts of later centuries were still far in the future, the foundational beliefs that would ignite them were firmly in place. The concept of maleficia, or harmful magic, was a very real and profoundly feared phenomenon. It was the idea that certain individuals, through dark arts and malevolent intent, could cause illness, death, crop failure, and general misfortune. And terrifyingly often, the perceived practitioner of this destructive magic, the figure of the witch, was a woman. This wasn't just about bad luck. It was about deliberate, hidden, and profoundly evil acts that could bring an entire community to its knees. And women found themselves uniquely susceptible to these devastating accusations. The concept of maleficia was not new. It had roots in ancient pagan beliefs about curses and sorcery, and it found new life and interpretation within the emerging Christian framework. While the Church officially condemned magical practices, it also paradoxically validated the existence of such powers, seeing them as the work of the devil. If the devil existed and could influence the world, then he could certainly empower individuals to perform harmful magic. And who better for the devil to tempt and empower than those already deemed weaker vessels, women? Pervasive fear of the unseen, of forces beyond human control, was a dominant feature of medieval life. When a plague swept through a village leaving piles of bodies in its wake, or when a sudden inexplicable blight withered every crop, consuming months of labor, People desperately sought an explanation that made sense, even if it was a terrifying one. Natural causes were not understood, so supernatural causes became the default. And for many, the most immediate and terrifying supernatural cause was a neighbor, a person who wielded dark powers. Consider the characteristics often attributed to those accused of maleficia. They were often marginalized individuals. The old, the widowed, the childless, the eccentric, those who lived on the fringes of society. These were often women who lacked male protection or social status, making them easy targets for collective fear and aggression. Their independence, their solitary habits, or their unusual knowledge could all be twisted into evidence of their dark dealings. Dr. Ilara Vance, in the Carolingian Law Codes, notes that while Charlemagne's laws aimed to reduce the prevalence of superstition in paganism, they also codified certain punishments for maleficia. This legal recognition, even if intended to suppress such practices, ironically solidified the public's belief in their efficacy. If the law acknowledged harmful magic, then it must be real, and someone must be practicing it. When disaster struck, the hunt for the practitioner would begin. Imagine a community in the depths of winter in 810. Odd food stores are low and the sickness is ravaging families. A young mother, watching her child waste away, hears whispers about an old woman, Martha, who lives alone in a small hut at the edge of the woods. Martha is known for her knowledge of herbs, for her strange songs, and for the way she talks to animals. To the terrified mother, Martha's knowledge of herbs, which once seemed beneficial, now seems sinister. Did she use those herbs to harm, not heal? Did her songs invoke demons instead of blessings? The fear was that Martha, through her hidden practices and her communion with unseen forces, had brought the plague upon them. The accusation of witchcraft was not just about doing something bad. It was about making a pact, conscious or unconscious, with evil. It was about using forbidden knowledge to subvert the natural order and inflict suffering. And because women were often the traditional keepers of folk knowledge, of healing remedies, of ancient stories and traditions, their very wisdom became a double-edged sword. When things went well, they were revered. When things went terribly wrong, their knowledge was twisted into evidence of maleficia. The monastic chronicle of St. Gall, while largely focused on monastic life, occasionally records fears of demonic influence and unusual phenomena attributed to malevolent forces, though not directly naming women as witches in the sense of later centuries. These texts reflect the underlying spiritual anxiety that could easily crystallize into accusations against individuals. The belief that demons could cause sickness or blight, and that humans could act as their agents, was a pervasive one. The physical vulnerability of women also played a role. When accused, women were often subjected to brutal interrogations, sometimes involving torture. Their perceived physical weakness meant they were more likely to confess under duress, further reinforcing the false belief in their guilt. Their confessions, however extracted, then served as proof to the terrified community that a witch had indeed been found, and that her removal would end the suffering. The scapegoating of women for maleficia during times of plague and famine was a tragically convenient solution to incomprehensible problems. It offered a tangible enemy, a human face, to the unseen forces of destruction. By identifying and punishing the witch, communities could believe they were actively fighting back against the plague or the blight, that they were cleansing themselves and appeasing God. The act of accusation, trial, and punishment, however barbaric, provided a terrifying sense of agency in the face of overwhelming helplessness. Consider the pervasive rumors. If a woman had an argument with a neighbor and then that neighbor's cow suddenly died, the sequence of events could be enough to fuel accusations of witchcraft. The farmer, desperate and grieving for his lost livelihood, would recall the woman's angry words, her sharp gaze, and conclude she had cursed his animal. This was not a world of complex legal arguments or scientific inquiry. It was a world of direct, often brutal cause and effect in the popular imagination. The witch was the ultimate explanation for bad harvests and plagues, a terrifying figure conjured from collective fear and desperation, and she was almost always, tragically, a woman.